My OS 5-inch gauge Stephenson's rocket. This is part 4, reassembly and setup. The lubrication system is definitely not working, so to verify this I'm disconnecting the oil union underneath. Because Stephenson's rocket was a very small engine, this 5-inch gauge model is also very small and everything is a little bit fiddly to get at. With the oil feed union nut disconnected, I'm moving the arm on the mechanical lubricator to see if any oil comes out of the pipe, and no, it doesn't. It's completely dry. I don't know what kind of oil was used in this thing in the first place, but it's left a really bad residue, and the residue, for the oil experts, is green. But it's not castor oil. It doesn't smell like castor oil anyway. What I'm doing at the moment is using cloths to soak up the oil that I put into the lubricator, because that's the only way the oil is going to come out of this lubricator. Maybe it's the check valve that's bunged up on the bottom of the lubricator, so here I am removing that just to have a look at it. In this clip I'm disassembling the check valve. It's a very simple thing. It contains a spring and a ball that sits on a seat. It's just a simple one-way ball valve. It will let oil out of the lubricator, but it won't let steam and water back into the oil tank. The check valve looked okay, it wasn't blocked up. What I'm doing at the moment is pumping some oil from my oil can into the feed pipe that via a T-piece supplies oil to the cylinders. Well, that's the general idea anyway. And the good news is this oil pipe is not blocked. When I remove the pipe, it starts to drain. And obviously if it was blocked, there wouldn't be oil in there. And also if it was blocked, oil would not be dripping from the cylinder, as you can see here. This is what I want to see, some lubrication on both of the cylinders, but particularly this one, which was very dry and very gummed up. I'm about to refit the cylinder cover to the cylinder. Before I do that though, it's time for a good clean up, because what I'm going to do is apply some Loctite 542, which will seal the joint between the cylinder cover and the cylinder. There aren't any gaskets on this model. All the mating surfaces seem to have some kind of a sealant in place. And the good news is it is not silicone sealant. I don't like using that. Reassembly is the opposite of disassembly, and so as you can see I'm refitting the tiny bolts that hold the cylinder cover onto the cylinder. This is a very fiddly job, and I'm using my specially cut down screwdriver socket set thingy. Most of the bolts were easy apart from the last one right round the back underneath. But I got there in the end without dropping any of these small bolts on the floor. All I have to do now is just nip them up, make them tight. I don't mean shear them off either. You have to be very careful working on engines like this. These are very tiny parts. What you can't see in this clip is I have a small Tommy bar through the actual driver, so I can apply a bit more torque to the bolts. I'm just refitting the piston of the crosshead pump to the crosshead. That's held in place by one Allen caphead bolt. And now using more of these small Allen capheads, I'm refitting the crosshead guide bars. I've been lucky so far, I haven't dropped any of these nuts and bolts on the floor. My new workshop is far more tidy than the old one, so I do stand a good chance of finding things that drop on the floor. In the old workshop, if things went on the floor, that was it, I never bothered looking for them. Time now to fit the connecting rods. First of all to the wheels. This is a single bolt with a plain part of the shank going through the bush in the rod. And then as you can clearly see here, on the inner part of the wheel, there is a nut and a locking washer. And in no time at all, the connecting rod is fitted to the wheel. Now I need to fit it to the crosshead. The plain shank pin goes through, followed by a very thin large washer, and once again there is a locking washer and a nut at the other side. Here's a good tip: instead of using a spanner to hold the nut in place on the inside of the crosshead, I'm using the shaft of a screwdriver up against the crosshead to stop the nut from moving. In this clip you can see that I'm applying copious amounts of lubricating oil to the bearings at each end of the connecting rod. First of all I'm just running one side, the other connecting rod isn't fitted. I've set the valve timing to an approximate position. I wonder if it's going to work. As the engine suddenly burst into life, it took me quite by surprise. From experience I had set the valve timing to sort of an approximate position. Even though the mechanical lubricator is not working, there's sufficient oil in the piping network because I pumped it in with the oil can, if you remember. And now the insanity begins. I've actually set the valve timing on all of the small linkages so that the valves move equidistantly over the ports, from what I can see from the external valve spindle. And now I'm adjusting the position of the eccentric driver. This is clamped to the axle, and a peg on the eccentric driver slides into either one eccentric or the other one, depending on the position of the lever in the cab for forward and reverse. I'm adjusting the valve timing by trial and error. I was lucky with the initial setting, but then I tweaked it and it was far too advanced. And you can hear that it's like that by the harshness of the sound coming from the engine when it's running. But by finding a sweet spot on the axle where the relative motion of the actual crank pins matches perfectly with the valve opening and closing on the ports in the cylinder, you get a very smooth run. And don't forget, there's only one side that's working. The connecting rod is not yet fitted to the other side. I just use the logic that if I can get the engine to run very well on one side only, it will run twice as good when I fit the other connecting rod. The engine's dancing about quite a bit, but the suspension is very soft, and I think the full-size rocket used to dance about like this because the cylinders are at 45 degrees and the pulling and pushing on the axle in an up and down motion. I noticed this when I looked at a photograph of the original full-size rocket, which is still with us. I think it's probably in the Science Museum. The cylinder positions were moved from the 45-degree angle that they are on this model to a position where modern steam locomotive cylinders are. Setting the valve timing is difficult for me. It's a bit of an obsession. I cannot stop doing it until the engine runs well. There has to be a medical name for this condition. It's not OCD. I'm definitely not OCD. I just have a bit of a disorder. Maybe I've invented a new syndrome called OVAS, Obsessive Valve Adjusting Syndrome. To break the monotony, I thought I would clean out the tank. Look at the state of all this gunk in the bottom of the tank, and it's really solid stuff. As I said earlier, I don't know what kind of oil this was, but I don't think I'd like to use it on any of my engines. I have a sneaking feeling that it may be motor oil, but I don't know. Once I'd scraped out the tank using a screwdriver, I then used a cloth on the end of the screwdriver to get the remaining pieces. This has been a very messy job, and I've enjoyed every minute of it. On the bench at the moment are all the component parts of this oil pump. And this is equally messy, completely gummed up with this very strange, very hard, very thick green oil residue. It's worth remembering that this model has been in a glass case for 21 years, so this is 21-year-old oil residue. And there's a large amount of it. It's very thick, very sticky. In fact, it's really horrible, just like a girlfriend I used to have many years ago. After I cleaned every part of the oil pump thoroughly using some cellulose thinners and a rag and a cloth and a screwdriver, I put it all back together, and here I'm filling the tank. Is it going to work? I look underneath while I move the lever and see what happens. Yes, it's working. In fact, it's working a bit too well. There's miles too much oil coming out of this. I'll have a closer look at it and see if I can modify the pump to deliver less oil. But it will be okay for the moment to have an excess of oil to flush out any remaining oil residue in the valve chests and cylinders. So here I've refitted the oil pipe and we're ready to go. But before I continue, there's a bit more tweaking required. Oh, excuse me, there's someone at the door. Oh no, it's the men in white coats. They've come to take me back to the asylum. So that's it for this episode. Thanks for watching. I'll be back after a couple of days in the padded cell. I hope you found it useful. I know I did.
And so did I.
Me too.
And him over there in the corner. Please take the time to visit my Mainsteam Models website. Click on the section of the website that says Video Playlists. And by doing that, you will find it very easy to find other videos that you may like to watch.